250 of the world's leading scientists, all who've published the most papers in this general area of circadian rhythms and light. And we reached a consensus that blue was the key thing, the sky blue color was the key, around 480 nanometers. That disruptive effect of that light in the evenings, the lights in the evenings should not contain any blue in them, and that there should actually be a warning label on most of the LED lights in the shelves today saying may be harmful if it's used at night, rather than it was used in cigarette packages.
Well, today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Martin Moore-Ede, and he is a leading expert in circadian clocks and our circadian biology, which is so exciting. And he has also led the team that actually located the suprachiasmatic nucleus, something that we talk about here at Dr. Janine. And of course, this is what controls our sleep-wake cycles. We're going to get right into that with Dr. Martin Moore-Ede, which I'm so excited about. He is the author of over 10 books, and most recently, his last release, which is now available, The Light Doctor. So you definitely have to check out this book. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And Dr. Moore-Ede has also authored more than 180 scientific papers all around the physiology of our circadian systems. He's a leader in optimizing the health and safety of the 24/7 workforce environment, which is so important. Anybody who works a night shift, you know how compromising that can be to your health, and this is something that Dr. Martin Moore-Ede has made it part of his life's mission to really help to educate others, and especially, you know, those Fortune 500 companies in terms of being able to optimize the light environment, which is something that I'm going to ask you as well. So welcome on into the show, Dr. Martin. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
It's so great to be able to actually speak to. So when I actually discovered, sort of by happenstance and being on social media and looking at, you know, some other people's posts, and to discover that you were the actual discoverer with your team at Harvard of the SCN. Can you please tell me about that experience? How did that happen? What were you looking for? And, you know, elaborate on that a little bit. I'm so super excited about this.
So actually, the first discovery in animals, of mammals, of the suprachiasmatic nucleus was in rats and hamsters. And yet the general belief at the time was that humans probably didn't have this, because there's no evidence to that in the human anatomy reports and books. But what we discovered was that the human atlases of the brain, where they actually take slices of the brain and then print them out, so you can look at all these different slices, and all the various parts of the brain are identified, the various nuclei in the brain and tracts. Well, we discovered, and this is just amazing, that only every 50th slice through the brain was published, and the other 49 were thrown away because it was just way too many. These are very slim slices of the brain.
Wow.
So they basically took a slice, every 50th slice, and they printed it. And so we went back and looked at all the other 49, right? And lo and behold, there was a suprachiasmatic nucleus. It was small enough. It had occasionally been seen in some brain slices just by randomly having to go through it, but and given a different name. And we discovered about 10 different names for this cluster of neurons, but no one had figured out that that was there all the time, as it was. And no one had figured out that it was the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So that's how we located it in the human brain. The other side of it was no one thought that light coming in through the eyes synchronized the human circadian clock. They knew that it happened in animals, all different animal species, but humans were thought to be different. Another major finding was to prove that actually it was light synchronizing the human circadian clock, and that it was because it was light synchronizing it, coming in through the eyes, going through special pathways back into the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It was actually the same mechanism that exists in other species.
Wow.
So that was how we got to that. And that basically made us recognize that humans' circadian clock systems are built in similar ways to other animals. and hence all the problems that were being identified of disrupting the circadian clock in animal research were actually just as applicable to humans.
Amazing. So, if you can sort of distill it down, when we talk about the SCN, it is what in simple terms?
It's a tiny cluster of nerve cells, about a pinhead in size.
Oh,
There are actually a pair of them. That's what I call the suprachiasmatic nuclei. We tend to use the acronym SCN for short, much easier.
yes.
Um, and these pinhead size clusters of neurons act as an internal pacemaker. They will beat the time very precisely, measure the time of day, and they will run at their own pace, which is slightly longer typically in humans than 24 hours. They run at their own pace if there is no cues from the environment to keep you in sync. So
Really?
basically, your timing will drift. And we could show that by putting people in apartments with no clocks, no windows, nothing to tell you the time of day. And they progressively get up later every day and sleep in later. And after a period of a week or two or three, they would have transitioned all the way around the clock to the same time again without realizing they'd lost an entire day in the process.
That's
So that
so
was,
fascinating. Wow.
that's how the clock works. And the clock is a pathway. The receptors in the eyes, we now know, we didn't know at that time that they're blue detecting receptors. We thought any light would work when we first discovered it. But more recently, the discovery has been that blue wavelengths, particularly sky blue wavelengths, are detected by a special photopigment, which is in a cells in and it's called melanopsin. It's in certain cells, which got again a fancy name, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Again, the acronym IPRGCs.
Yes.
Those cells in the back of the retina of the eyes are uniquely functional at detecting blue light, and helping determine what the time of day is and sending that signal back to the clock, which in turn triggers all sorts of hormonal cycles in the body that essentially tell all the cells of the body that it is either daytime or nighttime. So melatonin will rise at night, saying this is the darkness signal, and cortisol will arise around dawn, telling it's time to wake up. And so all of that is done. Those signals are sent throughout the body. So it's a well-organized system. And one of the things we did at that time, and I wrote a textbook at that time called The Clocks That Time Us, Physiology of the Circadian Timing System, for the first time pointing out that this was a physiological system, just like the cardiovascular system or the respiratory system. This was an entire intact physiological system devoted to keeping time and keeping us well tuned and in sync with the environmental world, but also in sync, all the tissues of the body and functions of the body in sync with each other.
Wow. So, the master regulator of this and turning on our entire body is light then, right? And you said specifically sky blue light. So can you elaborate what is that exactly? Because I know that there's different wavelengths of blue light, which how many nanometers are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking 480. So put the picture in perspective. Visible light ranges between about 380 to 780 nanometers. That's the scale. Um, Everything below about 420 is violet light. Once you get into 420 up to almost 500, you're in the blue range. But there are many different types of blue. You can have an indigo type of blue, a royal blue, a
Right.
sky blue, or an aqua blue. It turns out, and this was what we discovered, was that the sensitivity to light in the normal state, as we are in a light adapted state, that means your eyes are fully adapted to light, is quite a narrow band, and it focuses at 480 as the peak sensitivity, so which is right in the sky blue area.
Wow.
And that's quite important because once we found that it was quite a narrow band, now you can engineer lights and build them so they either do have or don't have that key signal in them. And that's been one of the keys because the current lights that we use today, the fluorescents, the LEDs, emit an awful lot of sky blue day and night indiscriminately. And that is what's causing a lot of the problems. In other words, we want to see that sky blue during the day, but you definitely don't want to see it at night because you're sending the signal to the body that it's still daytime when it's really nighttime. And hence all the restorative or repairing features of the body that you normally want to do during the nighttime hours, are disrupted. And a lot of those are very important. Those are processes that involved in whether you're going to get diabetes, whether you're going to put on extra weight and become obese, whether you're going to have heart disease, and very importantly, the risk of cancers, because the system is, when it's in sync and functioning properly, it suppresses cancer. Melatonin is a key suppressor of cancer cells.
Right.
But when the system is not working and melatonin is suppressed and the cells of the body are out of sync with each other, then in fact, cancers grow far more rapidly. And so that's one of the big concerns. We're seeing increasing rates of breast cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer, particularly in young people these days. Seeing big changes because we're all exposed to so much blue rich light in the evening hours. And it comes from lights, obviously, it comes from screens, it comes from computers. We are bathing ourselves in what actually is pretty unhealthy light.
Right. And so when the sun is rising, does that have that wavelength of the 480 in the sky
It
blue?
does. It does.
And
It contains. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, so and how does that change, or is it constant? As soon as the sun is up until the sun sets, is the 480 present and then it changes in the intensity? Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, white light or sunlight, daylight, even electric light that looks white or yellowish white is really an optical illusion. What we're really seeing is a wide range of wavelengths of different colors. So we've got violet wavelengths, we've got blue, as I say, that was in the 420 to 500 range. Then you've got green in the 500 to the 560 range. Then you've got yellows, then you've got oranges, then you've got reds. And actually, there's no white light coming out of the sun, right? It's made up of all these colors. Now, we see it naturally when there's a rainbow in the sky because the raindrops and refraction of the sunlight occurs, or we see it when light hits a prism,
Yes.
for example, your chandelier, and it goes against the wall, and you see this separation of colors. But that actually is what light's made of. People think light is white, but actually that's an optical
It's the
illusion.
full
So if you
spectrum,
look
right?
at
Yeah.
snow or look at the sky, which snow is a perfect example, beautiful white crisp snow
Yes.
actually doesn't have a single bit of white in it. It's a very broad spectrum of all the colors in the rainbow. So sun is a very full spectrum. Sunlight, daylight is very full spectrum. And that blue is part of it. So now, normally when you're using electric lights, we're seeing way much less light. So the big difference again is outdoors, we may be naturally in 50,000 lux of light or
Yes.
100,000 lux of light on a really bright day in a reflection of a beach, for example. Indoors, we're rarely seeing anything like 500. We're not 50,000 or 100,000, 500. Often we're living in 200 lux of light.
Oh, wow.
So we're actually spending our days in the modern world under twilight levels of lighting.
Ah,
And then we continue those levels of lighting into the evening. So that contrast, that natural contrast between really bright light with lots of blue and other colors in it, um, and is lost between that and then the nighttime naturally, which is very dark, pitch dark. And so instead of it going from 50,000 lux during the day and a tenth or a hundredth of a lux at night, we're sort of keeping the 200 lux level, 300 lux level, all the time
constant.
we're awake.
Yeah.
And too often when we're asleep. And that's another very important subject. People are now realizing when you leave the lights on at night, and 40 to 50% of people leave some light on in the bedroom, that increases your risk of heart disease, doubles the risk of heart disease, of diabetes, increases the cancer risk.
Mm.
And so that again is what we're doing. We really have polluted our world with light. And the beautiful thing about this, quite frankly, is unlike all the environmental pollutants we face every day, we're all worried about the PFAS chemicals, forever chemicals. We're
Right.
worried about other toxic environment, microplastics, whatever your latest worry is. Those are incredibly hard to remove.
Right.
But light, all you need to do is change the light bulb. But people need to understand it to know to go out and look for light that will actually solve this problem. So we don't have to give up on light. We just
Yeah.
need to make sure the light contains the right level of blue for the day and the right level of blue, which is very low or zero blue, during the nighttime hours.
And these types of light bulbs, they're readily available. Is it something that we can
And
share
now
links
readily
about?
available,
Yeah.
yeah, increasingly becoming available, absolutely. And so this is something that people need to invest in because people say, well, I'm going to have to spend $25, $30, whatever on a fancy light bulb. Well, the answer is the price will come down in time, but even that cost compared to okay, you get overweight and you get diabetes and you
Right.
pay $600, $800 a month for your Ozempic
Yeah.
prescription. You
Exactly.
know, one light bulb would fix it, right?
Right.
It's
And
cheap.
putting that, yeah, into perspective for people. And I know you mentioned earlier about, especially because a lot of my followers are women, the breast cancer risk, and they've done some
Yeah,
studies on
you
this
know,
in
let's
terms of shift workers, and yeah, I mean it's staggering. It's undeniable the link between, especially artificial light at night. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
absolutely. Basically, the staggering realization is that breast cancer used to be a very rare disease, one of the more uncommon cancers,
Right.
and so it actually is the growth of it is parallel the introduction of electricity, and the more blue rich that electric light is, the more there is. So interestingly, women who have never seen electric light rarely get breast cancer. Those who see a lot of electric light get a much higher incidence. So put some numbers around it. It's rather like smoking. There are people who get lung disease, like lung cancers from smoking, but there are people who never smoked in their lives and still get lung cancer. But that is only a fifth of the rate, so 20% at most. In
Mm.
the same way with this, women who've never seen electric light. And who are these women? Well, women before electric light was introduced. We can trace that over history.
Right.
Women in parts of the world where there is no electrification even yet, and there are millions of women living in areas of the world with no electricity, very low breast cancer rates. And also, very interestingly, women who have been blind since an early age. And
Ah.
that answers the question about, well, could it be just something else? Maybe we have more environmental pollutants and other things in a Western society that you don't have in more underdeveloped parts of the world without electricity. The answer is the women who have living in civilized, fully developed parts of the world who have not had vision for a long time
Mm.
um, from an early age, they rarely get breast cancer.
So
So
interesting.
again, the
Yeah.
story is pretty clear. Now, when you get to the shift workers, people who work night shifts,
Yeah.
the evidence has been the early studies all showed about a 50% increase in risk in people who work the night shift. But you don't have to work the night shift. You can be one of those women who sleep with the lights on in the bedroom. You'll
Right.
also get a raised rate that's 50%, even 100% higher. Um, so it's the science is very solid. We can replicate it in animal studies. So there are studies where you can take human breast cancer tissue and implant it on rats
Mm.
and watch it grow. And you can look at the effect of light in the rat to do it. You can infuse blood with melatonin or no melatonin from human women and
Wow.
infuse it into the rats. And depending on how much melatonin is in the blood, the cancers will either be suppressed or
Hmm.
they'll grow rapidly. So the evidence is very solid. The World Health Organization first recognized it as a problem back in 2007.
Mm.
So that's getting on almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
The National Institutes of Health recognized it by 2021 with a major study with 700 papers studied. Um, Again, the risk is related to the lack of bright blue rich daylight, too much bright blue containing light at night,
Mm.
um, And it's a very solid finding, but amazingly few people know about it. So one of the first chapter of my book, The Light Doctor, is called Edison's Cancer Epidemic.
Ah,
Um, and it's all not all to do with Edison because he had incandescent light bulbs, and they actually don't have that much blue in them. They do have some. By the way, candlelight and firelight, wood fires in the old days, have virtually no blue in them at all. So they could use light at night from candlelights and fires and not have this problem of blue light causing cancer and causing diabetes and other diseases. But as we moved into getting fluorescence in the 1970s, thereabout, um, and broad use of fluorescent lights, and then, of course, by 2000, about 2015 or so, really LEDs took off, the modern LED lights
right.
took off, which are very rich in blue. We've seen a huge range, a quadrupling of the rate of breast cancer rate diagnosis, for example, as a result of this.
Wow.
But it's amazing that people are not getting it. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, The Light Doctor, is to try to bring all this science, because the scientists know this. In fact, I chaired a study with 250 of the world's leading scientists, all who've published the most papers in this general area of circadian rhythms and light. And we reached a consensus that blue was the key thing. The sky blue color was the key, around 480 nanometers. That disruptive effect of that light in the evenings, the lights in the evenings should not contain any blue in them, and that there should actually be a warning label on most of the LED lights in the shelves today saying may be harmful if it's
Yes.
used at night. Rather, it was used in cigarette packages. Same way.
Do you think that
But
will
this
ever
is
happen, though? Do you think
well, that's
we'll
the
ever see
question.
that?
I mean,
I don't know.
it's going to be, it's a huge industry that has to be turned around.
Yeah.
$150 billion of lights are sold a year worldwide.
Wow.
Huge industry. But part of it starts with education. And the challenge is not only have the manufacturers got to build it, and we managed to invent lights and patent them and license them to the major lighting companies so they could be made, but also the consumer has to ask for them and know to ask for them.
Right.
And scientists talk to each other, and the scientists all agree, but
Yes.
they don't talk to their neighbors. So part of this communication, I'm delighted to be talking to you, Janine, because then you can get the word spread out there. People need to be aware of this, the science of it, read the book, use it to persuade your employers, your hospital, local hospital, or if you've got parents in the senior living facility, all of
Hmm.
them should be under health. Your children in school should be under healthy lighting, not unhealthy lighting.
Right. And beyond being able, sometimes we're in an environment like the kids in school, we can't change the light bulbs. What can we do as parents, or what can we do? If I'm a nurse and I'm working in the hospital, they're not going to change the lights because I'm asking them to. What other things can we do to protect ourselves in terms of that blue light? And just for people who are watching, if you're new to this type of talk about blue light, it doesn't mean that when you look at a light it's blue, because I think a lot of people have that misconception, because we all
Absolutely.
talk about blue light and so many nanometers. It
Yeah.
means our artificial lights, any type of lighting basically now in our modern world. The LED lights, as soon as you flip on that light switch, that typically is going to be an artificial light that has more of the blue light spectrum that you can't see. It's not full spectrum like natural sunlight, just to clarify.
Very important, very important. Yeah, people don't realize a light that's white can be made up of all sorts of different colors. Light is just an averaging thing that goes on in the brain, and you can have light that looks white that has got no blue in it, and light that looks white that has lots of blue in it. And there are devices you can use to measure how much blue there is. Manufacturers should tell you, um, but essentially, no, it's not. We're not talking about the blue lights on police cars type of idea.
Right, right.
This is not that type of blue light, but that is essentially something that people don't realize. That you've got to know, look at the label, and understand what the light contains. And as I say in my book, The Light Doctor explains how you do this, how you find it out about it, what type of lights to obtain, where to get them, and all the rest. And also how to persuade people, and part of it, you talk about the local hospital or some other facility. I talk in my book about the WIFMs, understanding the what's in it for me
Ah,
argument. Right? So you figure
yes,
out who you're
yes.
talking to and what's in it for them.
Mm.
So if it's your landlord um, and they're operating a building, there's evidence to show that when healthy lighting, circadian lighting, is put in place, they can actually charge higher rents. Well, that's something that is actually converts into lots of real money for a landlord, and now you've got the
Mm-hmm.
landlord interested. Um, Similarly, if you're talking to your boss, it's all about sick leave, um, healthcare costs, productivity, absenteeism. Those are the things you talk about that are all impacted by if people have their circadian rhythms disrupted and they're in this constant jet lag type state. So it's really a question of understanding how to make the argument
Yes.
and express in the way that is the whiffing for the person you're speaking to.
Right. And I know that you've done a lot of work with, Fortune 500 companies in terms of education piece. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my career, as I say, I did this work really identifying the circadian system and how it worked and the clocks and all the rest of it. And as we went on, companies started coming to us and saying, "Oh, we've got people working shifts around the clock and all sorts of erratic schedules, and they're perpetually, shifting from one nights to days to evenings and rotating and so forth. What can you do about it?" And so we started looking at that and said, okay, yes, the basic science we now know enables us to figure out what's the best way to design shift patterns and patterns of work. You have to cover all hours of the day, but what's the best way to do them? And how many days off do you need? And when should people sleep? And all the rest of it. And the first time we did this, quite a long time ago now, we put this in place, and we were just, in fact, I was talking to the manager of this plant, industrial place, and he said, what could you do? And I told him all the things purely based on theory that we could do. And he gave me this piercing look, and he said, "Have you ever done it before?" And I said, "No, no, this is going to be a great scientific, breakthrough. This is
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
be revolutionary." And his jaw dropped because no industrial manager wants to be the first to do
No,
anything
of course not.
proven. Um, and so, but eventually, he was desperate enough, and to take us on. And what happened was the health of the people radically improved, the absenteeism rate went down,
Wow.
and critical for the company, the productivity rate went up by 30%. In other words, the amount of product
30%.
coming out.
Wow.
No new people being hired, no new machinery, and the actual output of the place went up by 30% and
Wow.
stayed there.
Oh,
So we published that in Science magazine. It was like circadian science meets industrial optimization,
yes,
type of
yes.
thing. And as you know, that's a leading prestigious journal, scientific journal.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
and we got lucky in the sense that Dan Rather, that dates it, picked it up on the CBS Evening News, front
Really?
page of Wall Street Journal, New
Oh,
York
wow.
Times, Today Show, Good Morning America. I've never been able to do a publicity blitz ever since, that would
Yeah,
just
yeah.
happen.
Wow.
But before the end of the month, 300 of the Fortune 500 had contacted us and said, "Can you do the same thing for us?" And so that's when I started a consulting firm called Circadian. It's 40 years ago now.
Really?
Um,
Wow.
and yeah, and we've now worked with over half the Fortune 500 companies. We have offices around the
Mm.
globe: Australia, Japan, Europe, elsewhere. Um, but that is what brought me back to this issue of light, because when the World Health Organization came out with this report about breast cancer and light at night and shift work, and in fact, light at night and shift work was carcinogenic,
Mm.
specifically said, the Fortune 500 CEO said, "Oh my gosh, that's a huge liability problem. What do we do about it? We can't shut off the lights. We can't shut down our operations. We have to run the oil refineries and everything else
Right.
and the manufacturing plants nonstop. There's no way else of doing it. Got to fly the airplanes." Um, and that's when I delved back in and said, "Okay, what can we do?" And fortunately, that's when we're able to discover this narrow band of blue in the white light. It's inside
Mm.
the white light
Hmm.
that we can either add or subtract from white light by designing some very special type LEDs. That's when we could actually come up with a practical solution. And that practical solution, we've put it in dozens, literally dozens, over 50 Fortune 500 companies now. Great results, improved sleep, improved performance, um, improved health in those people, reduced gastrointestinal problems, and so forth. So we know it works. And now, as I say, it's really now starting to be spread out more broadly. So this is what the exciting times here with this. But the big barrier, the biggest barrier, I've got the technology, I've got the people manufacturing it,
Yes.
but the consumers have got to be asking for it because otherwise
Yes.
they're just going to buy the cheapest, what I call junk light. It's rather like junk food, right?
Yeah.
In other words, um, it looks pretty, it's cheap, um, but it is unhealthy as it comes.
And if you had to distill it down, if I were to ask you, okay, in terms of our overall health, we know that diet is important, we know that exercise movement is important, we know that light is important. Which one would you qualify as being the most important?
Well, I think I like to say that the light you see is as important as the food you eat, the water you drink, and the air you breathe. You can
Yeah.
clearly have unhealthy, polluted air. You can have water that has got lead in it or whatever else, and you can have there are a lot of environmental things out there. However, this is a pretty easy one to fix. As I say, it's just change
Yes.
the darn light.
Right.
Um, and and so, but yes, they're all important. There are many different things, but this is a big one. And really, I think what's important about it, it's one of the most overlooked causes that's easily fixable to health problems. We're seeing big changes with, as we put more and more blue light, more and more screen time. Um, we are pumping, because LED light is cheap, we're pumping more and more of this light into our lives.
Mm.
And as a result, there are all sorts of changes. Girls are getting menarche much earlier. In other words, before electric light came along,
Mm.
young women, young girls, didn't really have their first period until they're 17, 18 years old.
Yes. Yes.
It's now 12, 11 or 12, and sometimes as little as early as 9. Um,
Yeah.
and you've got to wonder about that. I've also been talking to a lot of people who tell me that, who are having trouble having children.
Mm-hmm.
Um, by really rigorously controlling their light diet, they manage to get pregnant when they never had before. So I think there's a lot more to it we don't fully understand, um, and uh, and certainly it links to a wide range of disease risk and general health. So it's a pretty big factor, and
Absolutely.
one of the easiest, quite frankly, to manage. Key is getting outside every day.
Mm-hmm.
You want morning light is far morning daylight, sunlight and daylight is much more effective than evening light. Interesting studies there. Psychiatric patients, another thing we haven't talked about, but anxiety and depression and other
Mm-hmm.
disorders are 30% higher in people who see very little daylight
Hmm.
or see too much light during the night. Um, and if you take people who've got various conditions, severe depressions, they have to be hospitalized, or PTSD, or other types of psychiatric disorders, and you put them in hospital to treat them, and they're given medications and therapy and all the rest. If they're in rooms that are facing east and south, in other words, they get the morning sunlight,
Yes.
even though they're indoors, they get out of the hospital, out of the psychiatric ward in half the time as compared to
Wow.
those treated by the same drugs, same therapists, same
Mm-hmm.
doctors who are in rooms facing north and west, who are not getting that morning sunlight. It's a huge effect.
And even
So I
through
think
the
we're
window, yeah. That because that was one of my
even
questions.
coming through windows when you've got a lot of, the typical modern windows, modern buildings has got a transmission factor of 25%.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taking out all the UV, it's taking out most of the infrared, and it's reducing the total light intensity by 75%. Um, so even with that, being exposed to the morning light, morning sunlight, is actually hugely beneficial. And so getting outside, I always say you don't have to be out in the glaring sun. In fact, better you do it before the sun is high in the sky.
Yes, yes.
Um, and that's key to the circadian clock because it tends to drift later. And so morning light just keeps it more regularly synced back into a precise 24-hour rhythm.
I see. I see. And so I guess as humans, depending on where you live on the planet, for instance, closer to the equator, the day cycle is much more constant, right, compared to our changing seasons. So, can you elaborate on that a little bit? I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Are
Well,
there
first of all,
changes?
yeah, there are, when you get too far north or too far south, and that basically is, especially get up into the Arctic Circle, obviously you get this land of the midnight sun, and that's very disruptive to the circadian clocks. It's the same thing. There's no clear signal of night and day,
Right.
even in the outdoor world. And that's very, very disruptive. Too much light during the night hours. Um, and obviously during the winter, it's dark all the time too.
Hmm.
Uh, Typically, the furthest north you want to be for circadian health is probably Seattle.
I see.
In other words, Seattle is about the most northerly city in the U.S. It's a little bit north of Boston and Chicago. Um, there at the summer solstice, they have a 16-hour day and they have an 8-hour night. So they've got enough night, 8 hours, to have decent sleep in and all the rest of it, not be disrupted by light. But go
Hmm.
much further north than that during the middle of the summer,
Hmm.
then the nights get too short, and that
Yes.
can disrupt your sleep unless you're really blacking out things. Um, what I like to say is that there's an argument that the summer solstice, provided you're, as I say, in the US, not in Canada, the summer solstice is probably the healthiest time of the year because you've got the maximum opportunity to get out and get that daylight around your schedule. And also because the light is, instead of becoming dark in the midwinter at 4 p.m., now it becomes dark not until 9 or later.
Right.
And at 9, it means that if you go to bed at 10 or 11, but you've only got an hour or two most of the use of electric light. So you're going to, summer solstice, you have least exposure to this harmful electric light, and you have the most exposure to daylight. So there's an argument to make. Maybe the summer solstice is the healthiest day of the year, provided we don't get a heat wave.
Right. And you can't actually comfortably be outside.
Yeah.
And so, what about when we change our clocks in crazy places like where I live here in Canada and we do the changing of the clocks twice a year? How disruptive is that? I mean,
So,
I know yeah.
yeah. How far north are you, by the way?
Uh, Toronto,
Oh, Toronto.
it's not
Okay.
too
Yeah,
bad.
that's not too bad.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, I did my surgical training in Toronto.
Oh, did you?
Um,
Oh,
I know the town well. So the daylight savings time is a very interesting thing because actually that disruption, that shifting of the timing of light and dark, is quite disruptive. And traffic accidents increased, heart attacks are increased, particularly in
mm-hmm.
the spring when you're forcing everybody to get up an hour earlier. Um,
Yes.
but what's really quite striking is that the difference between one end of a time zone and the other is quite large.
Mm.
It's up to an hour or more difference, and sometimes over an hour difference between one time zone and the other. About the time people are forced to get up is how unnaturally early is it, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that basically you're getting up in the dark on the west end of the time zone, and you're getting up in the light at the same time, clock time,
Yes.
on the east side of that time zone. And some fascinating studies have looked at the health of people who live on just one side or the other of a time zone.
Hmm.
And there's far more illness on the east of that time zone. In other words, the
Really?
people who are, yeah,
Wow.
than there is on the west side of that time zone. So if you look at, and this is done throughout the world,
Yeah.
by the way, it's not the US, but you just literally take those few counties that are just on the, just west of the time zone,
Yes.
they're much healthier than the people in the few counties, same rural community,
Hmm.
same community up and down the time zone,
So
significantly more
fascinating. Yeah.
illness, cancer, everything else, in the people who are forced to live in a sort of artificial setting compared to the natural day-night cycle.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's fascinating. So basically, um, it's something that I think shows us the enormous power that light has over our lives and our health. I'd argue, quite frankly, that everyone ought to be operating on their local time, um, and not have these arbitrary boundaries,
Yeah.
and adjust accordingly. There's no real reason why school has to start at precisely, 8 o'clock, when in fact you're another in the time zone. It might be better starting at 9.
Right. And is it okay? Is there a variance between male and females with the how coordinated, or if they become discoordinated with the SCN and the signaling of their clocks? I've read different, arguments as to the fact that boys tend to, at a certain age, teenage boys tend to need to sleep in a little bit longer for their growth spurts and things. Is that tied at all to the SCN, and does it differ amongst male and female?
Well, first of all, there is something that happens in males and females, boys and girls, as they get into the late teenage years, and that natural shifting of their own clock time later, right? And that accounts
Yes.
for why they sometimes get into staying up very late at night and have
Hmm.
a very hard time going to sleep, going to getting up in the mornings. And unfortunately, we have this strange thing where the buses for the kids who are um, the high school students come way early in the morning, sometimes
Yes.
6 a.m. to pull
Yep.
people up, whereas the younger kids get their buses coming later, like at 8. And I understand the economics of not having too many buses that you have to use. But the problem is it probably ought to be reversed
Mm.
because, it is much more stressful. And so the kids that are, where their light cycles are disruptive,
Hmm.
are actually performing less well in school. Very interesting study done by McLean Hospital here at Harvard Teaching Psychiatric Hospital.
Hmm.
They did a study with looking at the effects of teenage students. They were looking at what happened if we gave them one way to solve this problem, either, as I say, use light bulbs that have zero blue, or you can use blue blocking glasses.
Yes.
And those
Yes.
blue blocking glasses can prevent the blue coming into the eyes in the evening hours. And then they gave them screens that provided extra blue in the morning hours.
Mm.
So basically, they removed the blue in the evening and added the blue in the morning,
Yes.
and their sleep got better, their neural connectivity. They measured MRIs and all sorts of fancy things looking about how the function of the brain. But what mattered most to the parents was the math scores went way up in the
Ah.
kids um, who had this treatment and got their circadian clocks properly synchronized. And what we're doing by using blue rich light is we're pushing particularly those people who are evening type people. Some people are morning type people, some are evening.
Right.
Some
Right.
people don't get up early. I happen to get up early at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my wife can't understand it. But that's when my clock, when I get going. On the
Yes.
other hand, I get a social zombie, and I get too late in the evening.
Yes. Yes.
Um, so I go to bed
I can
relatively early.
relate.
So
Yeah.
that is something there. That's a type, and that's a genetic type. These are
Okay.
actually characteristics of genetics. The other extreme is the people who sleep in late, very hard to get going, but they're doing their best around midnight or later.
Hmm.
Um, Now, those two types are actually related to how sensitive they are to blue light in the
Really?
evenings. So, if you beautiful experiment done by Kenneth Wright at the University of Colorado Boulder, he took a whole bunch of people out into the wilderness in Colorado with no electric devices or lights of any sort,
Hmm.
no cell phones, no flashlights, nothing. Right? They went out camping, and during the day they were out exposed to bright, daylight, sunlight. During the night it was pitch dark.
Hmm.
All of them, number one, slept better, felt better, were healthier,
Yes.
all the rest of it. But very interestingly, the people who are owls back at home versus the people morning all got to bed, all reset to the same time.
Mm.
In other words, that difference has disappeared or largely disappeared between the morning and the evening people. And that tells you that what is actually happening in those evening people is they are people much more sensitive to blue light. The melatonin is more suppressed. The clock is more shifted by that blue light, and it actually shifts them later. So teenagers happen to have a phase for a few years
Mm-hmm.
where they get into this evening mode, which
Yes.
is a hormonal process that goes on. And so they're very sensitive to it, and they can get into real problems, not getting to bed till 3 in the morning and then having to get up to school at 6 and be grossly sleep deprived and all the rest of it.
Right.
But a lot of this can be corrected by having the right light at the right time.
Yes, and if they absolutely have to be, and this is for adults as well, if you absolutely have to be on a device, past sundown, because ideally that's when we wouldn't naturally, if we were living in a natural environment without artificial lights, that's when we wouldn't have, blue light anymore. Is to, I guess, wear the blue light blocking glasses. Now that leads me to a question, because they're all not created equal. I have a pair here, and should they be tested? So when you're buying blue light blocking glasses, I know that if they have more of a yellow tinge to them, should you buy from a company that for sure has tested for the sky blue for the 480? Is that even a thing that you can ask for?
It's a total thing.
Yeah,
In
okay,
other
good.
words, there's so much of the glasses, the more aesthetically pleasing they look,
Yes.
light tinted, a little bluish tint maybe. You pay an extra $200 to put in your eyewear, and so forth. Um, they're doing no good whatsoever because they're totally not blocking the 480 blue.
Right.
They're blocking blue down at 420. They're blocking the violet type light, but they're really not blocking any of the critical blue.
I see.
Others are blocking way too much of the green. You don't need to block all the green as well as the
Oh,
blue,
wow.
and others the others. So there are a relatively narrow band that you should be blocking, and that again is, I think, quite important.
Yes.
Um, and so they are absolutely not the thing. They're not all the same thing, and that again is something that I try to clarify in the book about
Okay,
how to
that's
find the
good.
right blue blocking glasses.
Oh, that's perfect. So everybody does need to pick up Dr. Martin's book, The Light Doctor. There is a little plug right there for you, because that's important information, because yeah, we know that anything that can be marketed is marketed, and certainly there's, I'm asked all the time on whenever I talk about blocking light at night, about which brand of, and there are certain questions that you should be asking when you're purchasing a good quality pair of blue light blocking glasses. So we have to get your book to learn more about that, which is amazing. One more question before we're out of time. I have a burning question about the microbiome and how that is linked up to the SCN, because I know that the microbiome gives off its own light, and the connections between, and this is just sparked by something that has personally happened to me when I travel to Europe. And my circadian clocks are trying to adjust to the new time zone. And, I try to make sure that I get bright light, sunlight during the day, and make it very dark when I'm sleeping. Yet I still wake up at like 4 a.m. and it's my gut. I'm so hungry. My microbiome is like screaming, feed me, feed me. Is there a connection to the SCN between the light in the microbiome and the actual microorganisms? What is happening there with that connection?
Food is a key, again, another entrainer. What calls the fancy word is Zeitgeber, time giver,
Yes.
through the circadian system. So, in the absence of light dark cues, you can entrain synchronized circadian system by meals. Some of the
Ah,
classic studies are done in bees and other animals, but you can show very clearly that you can synchronize to meal timing, and that particularly if it's a restricted food diet. In other words, one of the concepts behind restricted diets is they provide much more of a, instead of spreading the food randomly throughout day and night,
yes,
it's narrow time, and that synchronizes. So it is a cue. It's not as a strong cue as light, but it is a secondary cue.
it
And
is.
so, the mechanism of that occurring, and the involvement in the microbiome, the involvement of the, what receptors in the brain are involved, It's not the primary link to the SCN, but it obviously does influence the whole system. And one thing we perhaps didn't discuss enough, it's not just one clock in the body, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Most cells and tissues of the body have their own clock. There are millions of these clocks in the body.
Yes.
The critical is keeping them all in sync with each other. So
yes,
whatever
and thank you, for explaining that. Maybe you can, I've heard your analogy before, but maybe you can share with my followers your analogy of the whole orchestra. Can you go through that with us? The master clock and the rest of the circadian clocks.
Like a conductor of an orchestra, all right? So it is that keeps the whole thing in sync. But if you go to an orchestra and you let the players just go off and do their own thing, you get this ghastly discordant noise as they're all out of sync with each other.
Right.
What the master clock is doing is not making the music, but it is keeping all these various systems in sync with each other. And the more in sync they are, the more robust and high amplitude are the circadian rhythms. That is what amounts to health. So anything that increases and strengthens the amplitude of the circadian rhythms and their consistency, so they're not all beating out of sync with each other, is absolutely key. And a lot of illness occurs when those circadian rhythms circadian clocks in the body get out of sync. It's what's behind jet lag is that your gut is out of sync with your kidneys, which is out of sync with your other functions of the body temperature and elsewhere. So it takes time, and those different systems in the body take different lengths of time to adjust. So there's a period of time where everything's out of sync when you travel across time zones.
Which, when you think about traditional Chinese medicine, I don't know if you're familiar with, all of the organ systems and the organ clock, the circadian timing, and, in traditional Chinese teachings, they knew about this thousands of years ago that, certain organ systems had a preferential, most active time and how they were all coordinated, which I think is so fascinating. That that knowledge was there, is something inherent that intuitively, how we used to learn, right? That knowledge was there. Then now, coming fast forward years later, when you and your team at Harvard, of course, have discovered some of these things like the SCN, I mean, it's absolutely incredible.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to do, but there's some pretty important messages that everyone needs to know now, because they're actionable. You can do something really about it today, which is the great thing.
And if somebody's listening to this or watching us now and they are sick, maybe they have a, prognosis that's not so good, they haven't really looked at this aspect. Yes, maybe they've done the work, maybe they're on a medication, they've done the work with their diet, they're exercising more. Can you go past a point of no return in terms of, cleaning up your light environment? Or do you think that there's always the ability to have, some hope in terms of reversing disease issues that are happening?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think the opportunities for the body to do its natural healing and regenerative processes are really aided by having a very robust light environment. Regularity is absolutely important,
Yes.
Sleeping at a regular time, getting out at the daylight at a regular time, eating at a regular time. Those are very important. And making sure a life environment is not just, causing disarray and discordant rhythms. And so basically people heal faster, they get out of hospital faster when the light regimen is properly controlled. And it's really a travesty that today hospitals are still, have the bright lights on all the time.
Yeah.
And just do not understand what they're doing. So this is something where there's a lot of education. But yes, anything you can do to get regularity back in your life will aid those natural healing processes of the body and give you the best chance at the life you can lead.
That's amazing. Well, there is hope. And that's the thing about modern buildings too, is that the windows never open. Even modern, apartments and condos. I look around here, they're building condos everywhere, but there's no opening of a window. And of course, we know that the windows, like you said earlier, they block a lot of that full spectrum light and the UV as well, which is so important. Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate the fact that you were able to join me today, Dr. Martin Moore-Ede. Please, everyone, I want you to make sure that you're picking up his new book, The Light Doctor, available on Amazon. We will put links to some of the other things that we talked about in the show as well. Any final words before we say goodbye?
No, I think it's the time has come to do something about the light in your life, and I hope you enjoy the Light Doctor is written for the general audience. It's not a scientific book. It's one for practical advice and understanding, what you can do and really help in so many aspects of your life.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today, and congratulations on all your success, and of course all the more success that's coming to you with your new book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janine. It's good to be with you.